Welcome. My name is David Schoenbrun. I'm a professor of African history in the history department, and I want to thank everyone for coming to today's event with Troutt Powell. Hang on, I'm trying to do everything at once here. The Christopher Browne Distinguished Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2020, Professor Troutt Powell was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and just last year, she became president of the Middle East Studies Association. We're very fortunate to have Professor Troutt Powell with us today. She's quite busy. Before I go any further, I'd like to remind everyone that Professor Troutt Powell's lecture today, titled Posing Slaves for the Camera, Race and Memory and the Representations of the Enslaved, Khartoum, 1882, is the keynote address for the Cayman Modern Turkish Studies program's continuing series titled Reflections on Whiteness, Blackness, and Race in the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey. Excuse me. This series features interdisciplinary discussions of racial formation and racial thought throughout this academic year. Please visit the Cayman program's website for more information on this series and other activities. Now, it's a great honor to introduce Professor Troutt Powell, who, since the mid-1990s, has been a dear friend and a colleague in academia. Professor Troutt Powell is a leading figure in Middle Eastern studies, in African studies, and in Africana studies. She has broken new ground in historical and literary approaches to the multiple roots of racial thought in colonial and ex-colonial places, paying particularly revealing attention to the influence of legacies of slavery and enslavement. Her first book, A Different Shade of Colonialism, Egyptian Nationalists and the Mastery of the Sudan, which was published by the University of California Press in 2003, argued that to understand Egyptian nationalism solely as the consequence of British colonialism ignores the ideas about colonizing Sudan advanced by Egyptian literati across the 19th century. This path-breaking book blew up the colonizer-colonized binary by directing our attention to the salience of deeper histories of colonial ambitions to understanding a country's or a region's later encounters with colonialism. Those same deeper histories of colonialism also revealed regional intellectual histories of classic colonial categories, such as race, making the comparative study of racial thought much more than being about understanding its Euro-American iterations. Just before its publication, Professor Troutt Powell was awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. In 2005 and 2006, as a Radcliffe Fellow, Professor Troutt Powell pushed deeply into her next project, Tell This in My Memory, Stories of Enslavement in Egypt, Sudan, and the Ottoman Empire, which appeared in 2012 with Stanford. Troutt Powell in this book again demonstrated her rare skill in reading autobiography in historical context. Tell This in My Memory follows enslaved men and women and their enslavers from the streets of Cairo to colonized Sudan to Britain, into imperial Ottoman urban elite homes and on to Italian missionary centers. Set in the decades either side of 1900, Troutt Powell evokes the uncertainty and ambivalence of relations between enslaver and enslaved in a period of profound social and intellectual transformation. The book illustrates her characteristic skill at making difficult topics accessible without sacrificing historical specificity and narrative restraint. It is a wonder. Eve is an exacting scholar who respects the vicissitudes of language and loves its beauty. She's a generous mentor, an inspiring collaborator, and a gifted and prize-winning teacher. Her work resonates far beyond its disciplinary homes and regional settings. As we will no doubt learn from today's keynote address, Professor Troutt Powell sees things the rest of us often miss, even when they are right in front of us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Troutt Powell to our virtual gathering at Northwestern.
Thank you so much, David. That made me almost cry. And so that you all know, David Schoenbrun is one of my family's closest, dearest friends, and he is the godfather to my oldest child. And he and his wife, Carrie, are part of our family. So I wouldn't be the historian I am today without having been his friend and his colleague. He's taught me a great deal. Thank you, David, and thank you, everybody at Northwestern. Thank you, Gina and Amy and Enuchs. And I'd also like to thank Professor Ipek Yosmaolu for her original invitation, and I'm very sorry she can't be present today. So with that, I will begin my presentation, here we go. David, I'm going to count on you if you can't hear me to go like that, okay? All right. Soon after the introduction of photography in the second quarter of the 19th century, the eyes of photographers in Europe, the United States, the Ottoman capital, and its Arab provinces were drawn to the bodies of slaves, particularly African enslaved people from Sudan and Ethiopia. Their ways of viewing these people were influenced by their intellectual backgrounds, their artistic training, and their cultural and social upbringing. Their gaze could be deeply affected by current events in a rapidly changing Middle East, and how much money was paid by patrons commissioning particular representations for very specific exhibitions, scientific enquiries, or newspapers. Whether the camera became a kind of social microscope focusing on racialized types when applied to the bodies of the enslaved, or whether the camera mimicked and mirrored highly stylized Orientalist painting, those using this instrument were in constant dialogue with current discussions of race, inferiority, and colonialism, vibrantly so. Often the viewing of slaves crossed from literature to the camera and back, through literary salons and the international art market in which the Middle East was extremely important. The landscape and politics of Egypt and Sudan, in particular, fascinated European governments as much as the people of the region inspired topics for European art markets. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Okay, here we go. All right, so here is one sort of classic photograph, Sudanese enslaved woman on the left, and the relationship to either the master or the trader is more clear on the right. And here is a picture of young elite Ottoman eunuchs. These would have been eunuchs who were serving in households very high in the Ottoman social hierarchies. And then this classic, and this is from 1909, a photograph of Ottoman concubines and Ottoman eunuchs once Yildiz Palace, actually, I think once Yildiz Palace was closed. So my talk today explores how a dramatic series of armed occupation and political rebellion in the Nile Valley challenged the narrational talents of the camera. In 1882, Egypt's political movement, known as the Orabi Rebellion, had been put down by British forces, who then occupied the country. This occupation would last for 70 years. In that same year, about 1,400 miles south, in the city of Khartoum, Egyptian and British administrators and military figures were beginning to reckon with the rising force of the Mahdiya, an Islamic rebellion against the Egyptian administration of Sudan. Louis Vossian was a French diplomat who was sent to Khartoum in 1882 because of his talent for photography. Much of Vossian's work is still in print today. So well regarded was he for his abilities to chronicle the politics of the times. Vossian wove his sense of racial identities and difference in his work on late 19th Sudanese society. So this section of the paper is called Seeing in Black. All right. Here is one of the pictures from Louis Vossian's first volume. In 1884, two series of acclaimed photographs about the races of Sudan were published in Paris by Louis Vossian. The constructions of racial identity framed in Type du Soudan, as you see here, and also in Souvenir de Chartum et du Soudan Égyptien, or Memories of Khartoum and the Egyptian Sudan, echo themes of representations of Black bodies in then contemporary French art, and he paid very close attention to the vocabularies of race then current in Sudan. In 1881, Vuitton, a member of the French consular corps, was commissioned by Prince Roland Bonaparte to travel to the part of Africa then known as the Egyptian Sudan and capture by camera the images of its residents of its capital city. Bonaparte, a nephew of the former emperor, played a huge role in the establishment of French scientific institutions, most notably the Société Géographique in Paris, and this commission was one of many whose photographs filled exhibition halls with images of diverse people newly available or newly visible to French art, photography, and the budding field of anthropology. Vuitton applied great energy to his job and took 108 images for the volume, Types du Soudan. This is an authoritative volume in which the most important Egyptian, European, and Sudanese officials were presented, many of whom would later be known as major architects of Sudanese colonial history. But Types du Soudan is not only a who's who of colonial officials. Most notably for this essay, the photographer paid close attention to slaves. Vuitton chronicled the relationships between Sudanese women and their European or Arab husbands, registered surprise at the word marriage when interracial couples produced children, and regularly photographed enslaved people from different parts of the Sudan. The photographer left copious captions, some with the photos and some left in his notes, that show how fascinated he was with the varying levels in which Black people participated in Khartoum society. Vuitton's other volume, Souvenir de Chartum, was a more informal and personal collection of photographs. This volume visually documents his own relationships with Sudanese and European leaders and his own servants and slaves. Here, there is less reliance on the staging and settings of the pictures and more natural backgrounds like his home and the homes of his friends. There is sometimes a quiet peace in these pictures, a calm Khartoum in which the photographer is shown to be completely at ease with colonial daily life. But brewing behind the pastoral scenes was a huge rebellion in Egypt, in which Egyptian soldiers demanded Egypt for the Egyptians, and an Islamic revival and rebellion that was on its way to conquering much of the Sudan. 2 years after Vuitton completed his collections, the Mahdist rebellion had besieged Khartoum. By 1885, many of the officials photographed by Vuitton were either dead, imprisoned, or sold to the Mahdist armies. Drawing on the two photographic collections and Vuitton's notes, I would like to explore with you today why the networks of slavery figured so prominently and how the bodies of enslaved men, women, and children were staged and configured. As certain as the photographer was about where to place Black bodies in social and cultural hierarchies, Vuitton often expressed confusion when presented with or imagining racial mixing or racial passing. Damage was done to Vuitton's sense of race when he tried to represent what seemed to him the strange intimacies taken with the bodies of enslaved mothers, particularly those who were clearly treated with respect. Confusion is mixed with grief here. He felt keenly the power of the Mahdiya. Khartoum would change forever. By the time Vuitton's photographs were published in 1884, the Mahdi's armies had almost completely besieged the city. The relationships that Vuitton photographed were devastated by 1885, making it even more significant that these pictures became prominent displays in a European museum. Okay, let's see. All right, this is hard to see, I'm sorry. This is 1882 technology, all right? Louis Vuitton is at the center of this photograph taken in 1882 at his residence in Khartoum. The residence is the French consulate where Vuitton has performed the role of vice consul for 2 years. On either side of him stand two sergeants or chawash and his private servants, Almaz and Rizgallah. Almaz he names as a eunuch and Rizgallah as being from the Nuer tribe. Both descriptions would imply at that time that they were enslaved or liberated members of the consulate. This is the first photograph presented in Souvenir de Chartum, and it immediately introduces Vuitton as the authority with experiential authenticity. This is both technologically and culturally important. Vosson's 2 photographic volumes of Sudan were only the second set of books to be published in France that had photographic images embedded within their pages. This was a huge technical achievement that only became available in 1880. Culturally, it fortified a particular kind of faith in the veracity of the camera. And I quote from the French scholar Thomas Gazantre, "This authenticity of the gaze, reinforced by the transparency registered by the camera, is also the justification of the pact made between the author, photographer, and the reader. I went there and I saw it for you." Vosson was both author, photographer, and a political administrator for the French government, and so his dual authority is echoed throughout his volumes. Vosson joined the French Consular Corps in 1877, and his first major posting was Khartoum. He arrived at a time of increasing economic and political turbulence. The Sudan was administered by the Egyptian government. In Khartoum, this meant Turco-Circassian army officers, Egyptian soldiers like Ahmed Urabi, whose discontent with the Egyptian government was fueled partly by his service in Ethiopia and in Sudan. Coptic traders and translators, merchants from the Levant and from Europe, traders in Arabic gum, ivory, and people from Sudanese provinces. For years, the Egyptian ruler, the Khedive Ismail, had also hired British officials to regulate the slave trade. And in 1877, the most famous of these, General Charles Gordon, outlawed the sale of slaves from the equatorial province of Sudan in what is now South Sudan. The threat of economic loss was keenly felt in Khartoum's business networks, and the new law was interpreted as a provocation by the Mahdi and his followers. That it was issued by a Christian British military officer did not increase its popularity. As Vosson's photos show, the anti-slave trade law was not very effective. There are slaves in over half of his pictures, but its fitful implementation threatened a vibrant commercial tradition in which northern Sudanese tribes were deeply invested, like the Denakla, the Mahdi's own tribe. Gordon and other officials of the Egyptian government became the targets of the Mahdi's pronouncements, viewed as obstructionists to the establishment of a purer, simpler Islamic state along the Nile. In Egypt, concurrent protests against corruption, financial misuse, and increased European political influence took on a more secular, but no less demonstrative tone. Ismail, the same ruler who had hired General Gordon, had become bankrupted by the loans that British and French banks gave to his treasury. In 1878, he was deposed in favor of his son Taufik, and British and French advisors took over the treasury under an office known as the Public Debt Commission. This commission demobilized, without pay, thousands of Egyptian soldiers and officers, leaving them destitute in Egypt's biggest cities and in the countryside, and prompting Arabi's movement to reinstate their pay. This means that all of those photographed by Vosson found themselves in 1882 between two significant and growing movements, Arabi's and the Mahdi's, that meant to restructure the political and economic infrastructure of all major locations along the Nile Valley. Through his pictures, Vosson attempted to articulate the social status quo of these intimately connected regions of the Nile Valley. As in the introductory pictures of Souvenir de Chartum, the ladders of hierarchy are carefully resurrected. Louis Vosson was a government official fully vested in photographing racial and social hierarchies in the society of Khartoum. His pictures were dedicated to, and perhaps diminished by, their exploration of types rather than lives. Nor was Vosson an artist. There is no investment in the aesthetic of the slaves' bodies in his photographs. None of the pathos that we see in abolitionist photography of Sudanese or other slaves, nor even the beauty of Orientalist constructions of African skin color that can be found in photos taken of Ottoman eunuchs by artists who studied in Paris or who painted and studied with the likes of Jean-Léon Gérôme, the famous French Orientalist picture. So let me give you just a little taste of what audiences in France were seeing in a period not too much, just a few years. This is again Gérôme And this painting, versions of it were painted at exactly the same time that, or at least the beginning of the time in which Vossian was in Khartoum. And so it's worth thinking about, I think, what these figures, especially the figures of the African descended slaves or African slaves here, look like when you see more of the photographs that I'm about to show you. Now here is another picture of Vossian's servants. These are eunuchs. These eunuchs bear a familiar dignity, but remain silent on the page. They were in the first photo that I showed you. They are also tall in size, no hair on their faces, wearing foreign clothing, and on their heads tarbushes. The posture of their bodies serves as a protective gate, particularly for the vice-consul photographer himself. Any security granted to Vossian, a French citizen, would have to have come either from the British or the Egyptian army. There would have been no French soldiers in Khartoum in 1882 unless they had been hired by the Khedive Ismail or his successor. So Rizgallah and Elmaz are in this picture. They are never shown in any other role except that of guard. And in the more formal photos from Titre du Soudan, they are not even named. And so when you look at a photo like this, you have to compare the faces to the notes to know who these servants are. There is one picture, however, in Titre du Soudan that bears testimony to the unique relationship that Sudanese eunuchs had to local politics, wealth, and power. In this picture, and I apologize again, these are very, very old prints, 7 eunuchs sit for Vossian's camera. The short caption describes them as the principal eunuchs of the harems of Khartoum, but the longer description identifies them as a group of Black eunuchs belonging to the leading Muslims. They embody the power of prominent Muslims in Sudan and in Egypt, so worrisome and illegal in the eyes of French and British colonial officials, the power to continue buying and selling slaves. These eunuchs played a very different and much more intimate role than Rizgallah and Elmaz, those who were guarding Vossian himself. This sort of menacing haunting of slavery is also embodied in the photograph of Sheikh Suleiman, whose portrait is the first that Vossian racially characterizes. The caption reads, Sheikh Suleiman, pure race of the Sudan, provost of the Khartoum merchants. This note to race is important. Through Sheikh Suleiman, Vossian introduces his readers to the construction of religion and race in Sudan. When the Sheikh appears in print in the volume Souvenir de Chartum, the merchant is in the same pose, heavy, opulent, jauntily holding a cigar, but the caption is quite different. Here, Vossian represents him as a classic Muslim of Khartoum. And then the caption reads, he was the provost of the merchants of Khartoum, a dealer in ostrich feathers and more or less in slaves, has afterwards joined the Mahdi, a pure scoundrel. This could reflect Vossian's investment in the ostensible Anglo-Egyptian mission of General Charles Gordon, which had been set to extirpate the slave trade from the Sudan. It could also be an angry memorial to the majority of his photographic subjects who were either imprisoned or killed by the Mahdi's armies. But never in either volume is slavery repudiated. Sheikh Suleiman is a scoundrel because he joined the Mahdi, not because he sold slaves. The photographer's mission is completely buffeted by the slaves around him. Also represented in both volumes is the Syrian trader Fathallah Jahami. He was notable to Sudan for being an intimate of Charles Gordon's until the very last moment of Gordon's life. But in Vossian's pictures, he is more notable for his family. Fathallah Jahami married an Abyssinian woman with whom he had several children. And I'm sorry, I'm using the language of Vossian. So when I say Abyssinian, this is the terminology of origin used in his volumes. So Fathallah had married an Abyssinian woman with whom he had several children. In several photographs, he is proudly surrounded by them, even holding his mixed race children who are dressed just like him tenderly. And I'll give you, here is Fathallah Jahami and his unnamed wife. And please do notice their fashion, their gaze. And here he is with some of the servants or slaves in the house and some of his children. An important group of Vosson's subjects were notable for their own abilities to shift between racial identities, or certainly able to confuse the photographer himself. In some instances, French words like nègre, négresse, noir, arabe, and his translations of them into, and I will say it, nigger, black, Arab, cannot do justice, as if these words should ever be expected to do justice to the situation he observed. In both Type du Soudan and Souvenir de Chartum, no one is Sudanese. For Vosson, black, nègre, nigger, and sometimes Arab are used without respect for the slaves he has posed. They tend to be naked or half naked unless they are eunuchs. So the nudity of servants, slaves, dancers, and these women described as women described as Arab is a signifier of lives lived on the very bottom of Khartoum's social hierarchies. For those who visibly look to be people of color but who are not enslaved and who hold positions of power, Vosson places them more in terms of geographical or ethnic origin. Merchants and soldiers, consuls and doctors are Égyptiens, Syriens, pure race du Sudan, pure race of the Sudan, and de race turque, Turkish race, et de race négroïde, or Negro race. Europeans are Anglais, Grec, and Allemand, so English, Greek, and German. No European women are depicted in these photographs. All of the wives shown are married to Egyptians and Syrians and are themselves identified as Abyssinian or Darfurian from Darfur. Even the widow of the deceased Sultan of Darfur is posed. So Vosson also shows us Faragalla Ajouri, a mustachioed official with a, okay, wait, I think I missed. Well, I'll just leave this here. All right. A mustachioed official with a tall and elegant Abyssinian woman by his side. We see Ibrahim Effendi Khalil, a head of the Coptic colony of Khartoum, as a well-dressed man with a tarbouche, and his sons, born of an Abyssinian woman, holding, I'm sorry, my slides are getting mixed up and I'm not sure how to go. There we go. Okay, here he is. Then we have in this slide, Onorato Musi, a Maltese established in Khartoum as Vosson's wife, poses with his family, a Negress servant, and Maltese Abyssinian children. There is another picture, this time of Habib Khouri, right here, of which Vosson noted Syrian and his family. In the center, the Negress wet nurse. To the left, a Dinka servant. To the right, an Abyssinian servant. Now, please, if you can see it, take a look at this picture. The wet nurse holds the eye of the photographer. She is bare-breasted, and on either side of her is one of Khouri's children. Khouri himself has his arm around her. This and her direct gaze at the camera are the clues to her centrality in the household. She actually seems to be the household as they sit and stand posed before one of Vosson's white tents. And in a note that Vosson wrote a few years later from his second posting in Burma, Vosson described the situation of this photograph. The wet nurse is in the center holding her own baby and fixing her eyes to the camera, while Khouri's children, whose Abyssinian mother had died 3 months before. And so there is also an element of grief and loss in this picture. But I am absolutely fascinated by the way this mother becomes in the posing of the in the way this whole picture is framed, the little story that is told here. The next batch of photographs in Tipu Sudan shifts to only slave women and dancers, as if for a contrast to the photographs of families. In this photograph, we have displayed slave women of diverse races belonging to the chief of the Coptic colony of Khartoum. Now, you have seen a picture of the chief of the Coptic colony who also married an African woman. Like the Sudanese merchant Sheikh Suleiman, whom I discussed earlier, there emerges from this photo an insinuation about the nature of this slaveholder's power, this other business in which Ibrahim Effendi should be named. And finally, in this slide, let me go back. Okay. In this slide, I'm looking at the top slide on the left. Vossian photographed 3 little girls, all dressed up in their hair and curls, whom he noted as little girls born out of the marriage between a Syrian Catholic and an Abyssinian woman, and then the father himself to their right. These are the types that defy, just by their presence in the photographs, the pure races that Vossian was hoping to find. One senses from Vossian a great curiosity about the society of Khartoum, and yet a deep and judgmental commitment to hierarchical racial orders that conflicted with what he hoped to chronicle from the lens of his camera. He came from a society in which social mobility depended on the public adherence to this structure. In 1900, when he was the French consul in Sydney, Australia, he questioned the name of a consul general he assumed was illegitimate in a public and derisory manner. He was, in other words, a huge snob and very, very protective of his elite status. The captions that Vossian wrote for his photographs of miscegenation bear an air of the same derision and mockery of the African women's elevated positions. He made this even clearer when looking back at his volume several years later in his notes. He described certain African servants as the concubines, explaining, not wives, concubines, explaining that for the Syrian men, polygamy was widely practiced, not officially, but very much present. He went on that the picture of Habib Khoudi and his family, and I quote Vossian, gives an idea of the incredible mixing of races that operates in Khartoum and that make it so difficult to conduct ethnographic research. Vossian's derision of many of the Syrian, Egyptian, and Sudanese men in the photographs, whether they were Muslim or Coptic, suggests his own racial condescension to the men he considers to be not quite white. And this attitude adds to the sense of the hierarchies over which the photographer and his European audience sit on top. And how would non-European audiences view these pictures? The wives of these men, even posing for Vossian's camera, is a blurring of hierarchies. Muslim wives, Syrian, Egyptian, or Sudanese, would never have been allowed to be posed or exhibited in such a public and open way. As Mary Roberts has shown with harem paintings, women like these, who fit more into Vossian's definition of wife and not concubine, would themselves have protested. And she actually has a quote from about her research on elite women in Istanbul. Respectable Muslim women would not pose for European male painters. Thus, European women were commissioned to undertake their portraits. A major priority for the women of the harem was that these portraits were not to be seen by men. This requirement necessitated that the paintings were entirely executed within the harem, including the varnishing and framing, and that they be covered at all times. So the visibility of the slaves and the concubines in Vossian's photos here is paradoxically a cloak of invisibility to the cultural norms of public behavior and exhibition. And to conclude, the photographic conclusion of these Black bodies. In Vossian's Society of Khartoum, many of the protagonists we see in the photographs are dead by the time his pictures were exhibited. The photographer continued to keep close eyes on Sudan, noting that the eunuch Rizgallah was sewn to Jesse Pasha, a famous explorer and administrator in after the Mahdiya, and that Elmaz was sold to Yusuf Pasha, who was the governor of Shaka. These notes were sent also to King Leopold of Belgium, a monarch deeply interested in the racial hierarchies of other territories in Central Africa. Vuitton shared no record of what happened to the Abyssinian wives and the mixed children of the officials shown in his photographs. They live on, unclaimed in his pictures. Even though missing a photographic gravesite, the Black people in his photographs found ways in which to make their own light shine. They used ornaments or hairstyles or touched each other, details in which their humanity defies being bloated images of the Negro as loathed by Ralph Ellison. Here, so you can see on the bottom left, a small version of the photo, and I'm showing this to you to compare to the other pictures of other enslaved. And then here, in this more focused, we see a woman who has owned so much of the pose that even Vuitton cannot fight her. Her caption reads, Fadle et la Naze, négresse de Sénat, 28 ans, femme d'un juge de tribunal. In his notes, however, Vuitton describes her more carefully, not just as a negress from Sennar, not just 28 years old. He writes about her, a beauty of the country, wife of a tribunal judge. Her hairstyle shows the universal style adopted by the women of Khartoum province, ribbons and fine braids framing the face. With his hint at her stylishness, the reader can see this beautiful self-fashioning in many of the wives posing with their husbands, in the dresses in which they present themselves, and in the quiet stillness of their poise. We can see among these women a will to be seen and seen correctly. This essay, I hope, serves as a remembrance of their selfhood and their lives, untypified by racial categorizations. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that presentation, Eve. I think we can move into the Q&A part.
I'll stop sharing.
Sorry, you can
I'll stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, some people may want to see images again. We'll see. So, if the people in the audience have a question, you have two ways of asking it. You can raise your hand, and I'll call on you. You can ask the question yourself, or you can write it down, your question that is, in the chat. And then I'll read it out loud to even if you can't see it herself. So the floor is open for questions. While people are composing them, maybe I'll jump in and ask a question of my own. Eve, you said at the top of the presentation that this respectful treatment that was visited on, I see your hand up, Jessica, I'll be brief. I'm wondering if you have any sense of the time depth of that respectful treatment of enslaved women as mothers, the way that their bodies were treated in the representation, if I understood you correctly. Is that something that you can give any kind of time depth to, or does it just seem like something that you stumble upon in this particular set of images?
Oh, David, that's a great question, and I hadn't really thought about that, so I really need to think about that. In the time depth, do you mean, what exactly do you mean by time depth?
Well, I guess, literally, strictly speaking, are there earlier examples than the 1880s? I guess and the question has two dimensions. One is just sort of the literal presence or absence of this respectful treatment. Right. Of Black mothers' bodies, and then the kind of dissonance that you perceive with the image maker and the image itself. Some sort of a gap between the ethnographic realism and trying to craft that image. So just a literal question about are these the first images in which you feel like this kind of representational grammar is in play, or are there older examples?
I do feel that these are, I feel, well, I feel these are the first examples you see in photography. I'm not so sure about painting. On my website, not my website, but in my departments, on my bio, it says that I'm working on a book about the visual culture of slavery. And I have been working on this book. This book is working me. And that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out, because the painter that I'm focusing on the most is Jean-Léon Gérôme, and he goes to the Middle East. I think his first trip is in 1857 or 1856. And you do see moments of not respect, but intoxication in Gérôme's work. But Gérôme trained a lot of photographers who came to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris when he got his own atelier, and then trained them. So I'm trying to sort of trace it through Gérôme and the whole generation of people that he painted, and then sort of look and compare in Orientalist painting, which was fascinated by enslavement, and how that compares to these kind of photographs. These are some of the earliest photographs coming out of Sudan at the time. So it's a great question, and that will really help me, David, in sort of shaping this, help me finish this project.
Okay, thanks for that, Eve. Jessica, do you want to just go ahead and speak up?
Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Eve. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Lovely to see you, and inspiring work as always. I have a question about your work as a scholar using these images and circulating these images in the wake of, critiques of the circulation of images like this. And so how do you navigate that sort of ethically, while also being, responsible historically?
And I'm sure, Jessica, that you're thinking about the pictures of Renty and Delia that that Harvard University is trying to has been sued about showing, and who owns these pictures. I hope that by showing these pictures and eventually showing them in a book, I hope that it will, to use a terrible word, reorient what our gaze means about these pictures. I really hope that by paying attention to how many of the women, have dressed themselves, have posed themselves, because there are many, many more photographs. You see these women, they really dominate, in a way that runs counter to what the photographer was trying to do. I mean, it's masterful reappropriation of themselves. And I am hoping that my work does that work for them. But absolutely, I mean, in my introduction, I'll have to discuss it, I would say also, Jessica, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, I do want their stories to be told, their stories deserve to be told. And there is a push among Sudanese historians to reclaim photographs, to refine photographs, to create a photographic archive, in a retelling of Sudanese history as well, that I'm hoping very much to be a part of.
Thank you. I just think it sounds like you're calling for a different way of looking, a different kind of gaze, or that we as scholars could engage in.
Yeah.
And so fleshing that out for the readers, like how to look at these pictures, I think would be super helpful.
I think you're right. And I think anybody who chooses to write about slavery has to be very careful about what their voice says and how they frame it, which is something that I have to be particularly mindful of.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that was good. We have another question from Barry Greenman. Barry, you have the floor. You might be muted. I don't hear you if you're speaking.
Okay, I would like to ask, was the man that took those photos trying to reinforce the traditional racial stereotypes of Europeans in the 19th century?
Yes, he was. He definitely was.
Mhm.
Yeah. He was trying to reinforce that. He went looking for that and tried to, that's why I call this posing the slaves for the camera. He tried to pose them in a way that it would show that, you know, Europeans on the top, you know, Arabs, Maltese in the middle, you know, people who would not have called themselves Arabs, by the way, you know, and then different hierarchies of Black identities as well. But the camera, his camera belied his mission.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have a question, just raise your hand so I can see you. Okay, so I see Shayna Silverstein. You have the floor, Shayna.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Powell, for the presentation. I taught your work a couple of years ago, so I'm sorry if what I'm about to represent is maybe not as subtle and nuanced in either the detail or the analysis, but it was a material talking about the intimacy of household relations among Sudanese slaves in turn of century Egypt and Cairo. And I believe some of the primary sources were text-based, whether memoirs or letters, and kind of recollections of people growing up and how much the importance of the people who raised them, some of whom were enslaved. And so you were talking a little bit about the public and private dichotomy of how racialization happens between the intimacy of the household and the home, and then the diacritics of how racialized bodies play out in street and public life at that time. And so I'm just kind of curious how you see this current work connecting to those same questions of the intimacy of the household, but from a very different authorial perspective, you know, that of the foreign photographer. And, you know, it was just really wonderful to hear all of these stories and the fabric and texture of the lives represented in the photograph, and how blurred they are in terms of kinship and race, but also hierarchy and status and enslavement. So how do these connect or not connect? How are they dissonant? What do they say about each other? It's kind of the open-ended question. Thanks.
Shayna, can I ask, are you referring to Tell This in My Memory?
I believe so. I'd have to go look at the syllabus again.
Okay.
Yeah.
So actually, this book project comes from a rejected chapter from Tell This in My Memory. I wanted to do a whole chapter about the British Army and their encounter with formerly enslaved Sudanese people who they used as guides when they went back in 1898 to reconquer Sudan. And I was going to do, I did a whole chapter. Well, I was going to do a whole chapter, and Kate Wall of Stanford University Press was like, I don't think that works. This is a book about narratives, tales. This is not a book about images. So, so that's why I'm writing this book. And I'm glad you reminded me, because I need to, you just gave me some direction to go back to the British soldiers and the encounter. So it's not, it is different. This is a very different project for me, though, because when I was writing Tell This in My Memory, I hadn't taken any art history courses. I didn't know how to read a photograph. And I think I'm learning a lot more now about how to read paintings and how to read a photograph. And it's such a different world of trade. The visual trade, or the the trade in prints and paintings of enslaved people, all right, in the Middle East becomes so popular in the 1860s and 70s and 80s during a time that's very troubled in French history, but it's also really popular in United States homes right after the Civil War, and this is Jean-Léon Gérôme. This is his doing in many ways. Orientalist painters in England tended to have to cope much more with abolitionist critique. This is not the case in France at all. And these paintings are bought by Ottoman sultans, by Egyptian khedives, by later members of the Egyptian monarchy. They are still currency of trade for elite art collectors in the Middle East. And so I'm just fascinated by, how Orientalism works in as Edward Said told us, but then it turns out there are all these other ways in which it happened. So I am trying to take some of my same arguments from before in my, kind of career-long quest to tell stories or show people whose identities we have often argued about into the dust, erasing them completely. So I hope that answers your lovely question. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. Are there any other questions from the floor before I call on myself again? Yeah, don't let me get started, so please jump in. Elzbieta, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the role of religion here. I noticed that one of the Syrians was actually dubbed Catholic to make it clear that he was Christian. And also, I would assume that many Muslims would not want to be photographed, right? So what is the role of religion in these photographs these wonderful photographs you showed us?
Well, thank you for that. The only role I have attributed to religion here is the role that Vuitton himself attributed to it. And maybe I should go more deeply into it, because there are lots of Muslims being photographed by this stage in the 19th century, all across the Middle East. It's not just Vuitton. There are, let's see, by this time, Sultan Abdulhamid II has completely adopted the technology of the camera and has hired, Abdallah Frère, Pascal Sebah, sometimes Armenian photographers, sometimes Christian photographers, but definitely from the region. And he is sending photographers out throughout the Ottoman Empire to also photograph types, Ottoman types. So I would say that where I think religion is important is that Muslim women would not have or would not have allowed themselves to be photographed. I think that's pretty well documented. But I think also that there's a particular role that needs to be explored about Coptic communities in Upper Egypt or the middle of Egypt, and sort of their relationship to certain forms of enslavement. But it also shows you what Khartoum was like. It was a really multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious city, sort of for the Egyptians on the frontiers, but a mix.
Would most of the slaves retain their own religions, or would they have to become would they have to accept Islam?
It depends how elite they became. It depends into what households I think they became. I think that the eunuchs, who all had Muslim names, would have been converted. But I'm guessing that some of, as you asked the question, I wonder if some of the elite women from Darfur might have allowed themselves to be photographed. So it's something we're thinking about, because they would have been Muslim. So that's a good, I will go back through there about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sophia. Is there anyone else who has a question? Yes, Enuchs, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much for this fascinating talk and for showing these images and discussing them. I think you showed us so clearly how this photographer came with an agenda to prove, his own conceptualization of racial hierarchies and how the subjects of these images thwart his mission. So I'm wondering what happens after the beginning of the Mahdiya and the ousting of these kinds of, this photographer in particular, and how these relationships might have been represented afterwards. Are there any photographs in any archive that show what might have been going on afterwards, or maybe if not, photographs in texts or other archives? I don't know if you had a chance to look into that, but I was just wondering, and then what, post the end of the date of this talk. So thank you so much. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Enuchs, for that wonderful question. I'm going to take it as an intervention, because that's also a good direction to go in. So I have to say, and I should have said this at the beginning, that this is actually half of a chapter. And the chapter came out last year in a Bloomsbury edition of Fashioning the Middle East, edited by Raina Lewis and Yasmin Tan. And the other half of this chapter is actually my comparison of Vossian's photos to a novel by Georgi Zeydan, the famous Lebanese Syrian emigre to Egypt, who really becomes in many ways one of the parents of the Nahda, the cultural reawakening in Egypt. And so he has a book called Asir al-Mahdi, or Prisoner of the Mahdi, and which he wrote in 1892. And in this book, and this book is wild. So there is an Egyptian soldier who is light-skinned, who goes to Sudan to fight for the British. Georgi Zeydan was in Khartoum at exactly the same time as Vossian was in Khartoum. Georgi Zeydan was an agent for British intelligence because he was so multilingual. And so he has a character just like him who is there with the Mahdi. With General Charles Gordon. And so, and there he tells the story of who died, who lived, who died, who lived. So in the completed chapter, and I'm going to rework it for the book, but in the completed chapter, you do see better, because Georgi Zeydan knew better. He stayed in Egypt, he didn't leave. Who lives and who dies. Although Georgi Zeydan is not all that interested in the lives of Sudanese.
We've got one more minute to go on Eve's hour with us. I'm wondering if anyone has a last question to ask. Well, if not, then it remains for me to thank you, Eve, for spending time with us and letting us in on the secrets of what you're learning. I enjoyed it very much and look forward to continuing the conversation offline. Okay.
Okay, thank you, my dear friend. And I saw a lot of other dear friends and colleagues in the audience. I really appreciate your coming. Thank you so much for hearing me out. Your questions are really helpful.
Be well. Take care.
Be well, everybody. Be safe and well.